The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences released a set of diversity standards that must be met before a movie can be considered for a Best Picture award at the Oscars. Such being the case, I predict the death of Hollywood as we know it, unless they reverse course immediately. I'll explain what I mean after this word from my sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by Black History Quiz because it takes more than a month to learn our history. History is not black and white. It's complicated. America was built on slave labor, yet blacks owned slaves as well. The Republican Party was founded to abolish slavery, but today most blacks vote Democrat. And sometimes, just sometimes, African kings marry white. No matter the race, people are complicated, filled with contradictions, and change with the times. To view history through the lenses of today's culture cheats the learner of the full story. Black History Quiz is a newsletter that shares facts you might not have learned in school and certainly did not learn from mainstream media. Black History Quiz educates, sparks debate, and often puts history in a brand new light. Visit blackhistoryquiz.com and subscribe to the weekly newsletter. No matter your perspective of history, you will not be disappointed. blackhistoryquiz.com. This past week was a remarkable one for the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts. Well, they issued new diversity standards that must be met before a movie can win the coveted Best Picture award. I will cite some of them, reading directly from Oscars.org. For the 96 Oscars 2024, a film must meet 2 out of 4 of the following standards to be deemed eligible. At least one of the lead actors or significant supporting actors is from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group: Asian, Hispanic, Black, African American, Indigenous, Native American, Alaskan, Native, Middle Eastern, North African, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, other underrepresented race or ethnicity. At least 30% of all actors in secondary and movie minor roles are from at least 2 of the following underrepresented groups: women, ethnic group, LGBTQ+, people with cognitive or physical disabilities, or who are deaf or hard of hearing. The main storyline or storylines, theme, or narrative of the film is centered on an underrepresented group: women, racial or ethnic group, LGBTQ+, people with cognitive or physical disabilities, or who are deaf or hard of hearing. The standards continue to include requirements for the people who work behind the camera, training opportunities, industry access, and even how the film should be marketed. Understandably, there was some pushback from some in the motion picture industry who saw these rules as stifling creativity. Chief among them, the actress Kirstie. Here she is being quoted by Access Hollywood.
Kirstie isn't happy about the new Oscars diversity requirements. The star took to Twitter to blast the new rules. It's a disgrace to artists everywhere. Can you imagine telling Picasso what had to be in his paintings? You people have lost your minds. Control artists, control individual thought. Oscar Orwell. The It Takes Two star continued in another tweet, calling the rules dictatorial. I've been in the Motion Picture Academy for 40 years. The Academy celebrates freedom of unbridled artistry expressed through movies. The new rules to qualify for Best Pictures are dictatorial. Anti-artist, Hollywood, you're swinging so far left, you're bumping into your own ass, she wrote.
Others in Hollywood saw it differently. Cal Buchanan of the New York Times said, "Will anything truly change? Yes, but it's something far harder to measure: perception. Even if the new guidelines allow ample workarounds, they will probably spur filmmakers, financiers, and studio executives to take the issue of diversity more seriously, and could especially be a boon to department heads of color. And now that the issue is on the table, Oscar voters may be interested to learn just how specifically a contender's diversity standards were met." End quote. I understand what Hollywood is trying to do with these new rules, but what would likely happen? The quality of movies being produced will decrease. Big movie studios will lose market share, and indie film producers will struggle to get distribution. Now, I don't say any of that as an experienced film critic or industry analyst, but as someone who has seen this same scenario play out before. Let me share with you 3 examples. Example 1. Diversity quotas and the FAA. Here's a quote from The Blaze. For decades, the selection process for the Federal Aviation Administration's air traffic controllers was rigorous. After all, one minor mistake could cost hundreds of people their lives. But a new report from Fox News host Tucker Carlson revealed that the Obama administration modified the FAA's candidate selection process to value workplace diversity over competency, experience, and skills. What are the details? According to Carlson, due to changes implemented during the Obama administration, air traffic controller candidates are now required to complete a biographical questionnaire before even being considered for a job with the FAA. If they don't pass, they aren't considered for a position, no matter how much experience they have or how qualified they are. Fox News obtained a copy of the questionnaire and how it scored. According to Carlson, candidates whose worst subject in high school was science and who played a lot of sports, and candidates who are unemployed received the most points possible on the test. In contrast, licensed pilots and those with extensive air traffic control knowledge aren't highly scored. Tucker Carlson did a follow-up on that story, which dated back to June 2018. Here is a partial recap on that follow-up.
Well, the FAA has for decades been one of the most trusted institutions in government, and for good reason. Commercial air travel has been the safest in the world, in part because of the FAA's high standards. But under the Obama administration, that began to change radically without anybody paying attention. The Obama administration pressured the FAA to meet abstract diversity goals. Now, nobody bothered to explain why diversity is a relevant criterion for air traffic controllers. No one will explain it now. We called the FAA today, and we got silence when we asked that question, which is the most basic question. But it didn't matter. Starting in 2014, the FAA added a biographical questionnaire to the application process. Applicants with a lower aptitude in science got preference over applicants who'd scored excellent in science. Applicants who'd been unemployed for the previous 3 years got more points than licensed pilots got. In other words, the FAA actively searched for unqualified air traffic controllers. That is insane, and they knew it was insane when they did it, but they did it anyway. Today, we obtain new information. It is an internal email written by an executive at the firm that devised the FAA's biographical questionnaire. In that email, the executive admits that the test he devised has nothing to do with finding the best air traffic controllers. If you want good air traffic controllers, find people with experience. That was his advice. The FAA ignored the screen anyway. They didn't care about finding the best air traffic controllers. Compared to diversity, your safety meant nothing to them.
I'm looking at the FAA.gov website and the minimum requirements they list for air traffic control specialists. As I scan through here, I see nothing referring to a, quote, biographical questionnaire. However, on the Mountain States Legal Foundation website is an article dated November 1st, 2019. It's an interesting article that I won't quote, but I'll just read the headlines. Biographical questions force top air traffic controller candidates out of FAA hiring pool. Try not to think about that next time you or a loved one is on a plane. Example 2. Diversity quotas and the women of Norway. Hat tip to theconversation.com and Los Angeles Times, where I found these bits of interesting research. In 2003, the Norwegian government passed a law that required companies to have at least 40% of company board members to be women. In place since 2006, it stipulated dramatic regulatory measures for non-compliance. After an initial grace period of 2 years for existing companies, a failure to achieve the 40% quota would lead to the company being delisted. The initial reactions in Norway were strong and overwhelmingly skeptical, and arguments elsewhere opposed to quotas mirror those raised in Norway in 2006. They range from the principle, such as the unfortunate tampering with free market mechanics, to the practical, such as the severe lack of qualified women. So, what happened since then? Well, research suggests that more than 10 years later, the mandate has not significantly increased the number of women in senior management positions, nor has it reduced the pay gap between men and women. 7 years after the quota was enacted, the country had no female CEOs. Again, the country of Norway had no female CEOs. Similarly, women occupy only 10% to 20% of senior management jobs in France, Germany, and the Netherlands, despite 30% to 40% female board member quotas in those countries. Data regarding whether having more female board members improves corporate performance is mixed, but it may harm corporate performance in industries where firms are forced to fill the quotas with less experienced women. Let's think about this for a minute. If there is a law mandating that women be on boards and a decade later there are no female CEOs or a significant reduction in pay gaps, what could one conclude from that? My initial thought is that women may not want to be CEOs at the level that society may want them to be, opting instead to raise families at home. I could be wrong. I have not researched that yet. Maybe that'll be a future podcast. Example number 3, diversity quotas and the Winter War. A quote from History.com follows this clip from an old newsreel.
Yet another air raid on Helsinki. This time the camera catches the horror these dastardly attacks bring into the lives of the children as they dash terror-stricken to the shelters. It's tragic that kiddies should be made to suffer in this way. Even war is no excuse. But the Finns are a gallant people. Actually, during this particular raid, the firemen dealt with many conflagrations. All this in a temperature 30 degrees below. And now for the aftermath of the Battle of Suomussalmi, in which the Finns were gloriously victorious over the Russian hordes. Here are a few of the prisoners taken by the defenders.
Less than 2 years before the Soviet Union faced off against Nazi Germany during World War II, it waged a bloody war against the tiny nation of Finland. Russia's feud with its Nordic neighbor began in 1939 when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin looked to expand his influence over Eastern Europe. Citing concerns about a potential attack by the Germans, Stalin demanded that Finland's border with Russia be moved back 16 miles along the Karelian Isthmus to create a buffer zone around the city of Leningrad. He also wanted the Finns to hand over several islands in the Gulf of Finland and lease the Soviets' territory on the Hanko Peninsula for construction of a naval base. The Soviets offered a large swath of Russian territory as part of the deal, but the Finns were suspicious of their motives and turned them down. On November 30th, 1939, following a series of ultimatums and failed negotiations, the Soviet Red Army launched an invasion of Finland with 500,000 troops. Now, the Finns eventually lost the war with Stalin, but it came at a very high price for Russia. The whole fight lasted about 3 months. Now, at their strongest, the Finns had about 300,000 soldiers on their side. And by the end of the conflict, they suffered 65,000 casualties, which is roughly 22% of their forces. Conversely, Stalin had 500,000 troops and vastly superior numbers in aircrafts and tanks. Yet he lost 60% of his troops, 300,000 soldiers. Why did that happen? Well, there were a number of factors that favored the Finns. They had home turf advantage, weather conditions were in their favor, highly effective guerrilla tactics as well. But their biggest advantage may have been in how Stalin recruited his officers. You see, Stalin did not look for the best talent. His focus was on how well they adhered to Marxist ideology, his way of thinking. Such was the diversity quota of his day. So, considering all of that, what do I think will likely happen with the diversity quotas set by Hollywood? Well, again, I understand what Hollywood is trying to do with these new rules, but what will likely happen is the quality of movies will decrease. And I say that because artists will have to check certain boxes, and because of that, they want to have the freedom to express their ideas fully as they want to. So you can expect cookie cutter content that looks like all the other content that had to follow the same guidelines. Long gone will be the cutting edge TV comedies that challenged audiences like All in the Family, In Living Color, Married with Children, or movie comedies like Blazing Saddles, one of my personal favorites. Although it might mean DVR sales of that classic content will go through the roof. I think the major studios will lose market share and suffer heavy losses until it gets to a point where they lose so much money that the rules are changed back in their favor. If you look up the term go woke and go broke, you will find many examples of how the entertainment industry and major brands went out of their way to embrace political correctness and suffered heavy financial losses. The BBC reported that the last Oscar event, for example, hit an all-time ratings low. Something has to give eventually. Until that happens, it's going to be rough on the independent films who need the big studios to distribute their work so they can connect with the masses. The indie filmmakers will likely picture requirements of the Academy and likely receive the adoration of the public for producing art instead of more conformist debris. Maybe these indie filmmakers will find success on live stream channels or build their own distribution chain and challenge the powers that be. I hope so. I really do, because I'm almost done binging The Office and I need something new to watch. You have been listening to the Things I Think About podcast. If you love what you heard, hate what you heard, or don't know what you just heard, I want to know about it. Drop me an email. I can be reached at jimstroud, that's JIMSTROUD, @jimstroud.com. So, until next time, bye-bye.